In 480 BC, 300 Spartan warriors stood at Thermopylae and held back the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen, buying Greece precious time before their inevitable deaths became the stuff of eternal legend. Hollywood gave us Gerard Butler screaming, "This is Sparta," while throwing Persian messengers down wells. And we ate it up because who doesn't love the underdog story of perfect warriors facing impossible odds? But here's what they didn't show you in the movie. Every single one of those 300 men standing in that pass was the survivor of a state-mandated quality control inspection conducted when they were 7 days old, where elders examined naked infants and decided who lived and who got carried to a mountain ravine to die of exposure. The Spartans weren't born perfect warriors through some genetic lottery or divine blessing. They were manufactured through the most comprehensive, brutal, and methodical human breeding program in Western civilization, a 500-year experiment that turned mothers into state-owned incubators, babies into products that passed or failed inspection, and an entire enslaved population into legal murder victims whose deaths were considered patriotic duty. If this sounds darker than anything Hollywood showed you, that's because the real story of Sparta isn't about glory or honor or standing against tyranny. It's about what happens when a society decides that perfection justifies any cost, including the systematic destruction of everything that makes us human. Before we dive into exactly how Sparta engineered its warriors and why the entire system collapsed so spectacularly that within 2 centuries they became a tourist attraction for wealthy Romans, hit that subscribe button because this is the history they definitely didn't teach you in school. And if you make it to the end, drop a comment telling me which ancient civilization's dark secrets you want exposed next. Every totalitarian system needs an origin story, and Sparta found theirs in a semi-mythical figure named Lycurgus, who ancient sources claim received divine approval from the oracle at Delphi to completely restructure Spartan society according to principles that would make modern authoritarians blush. The problem is that ancient historians couldn't even agree on when this guy lived. Plutarch places him in the 9th century BC. Other sources suggest the 7th century. And modern scholars increasingly suspect he never existed at all, but was instead a convenient fiction onto which Spartans projected their entire social system to give it the weight of divine authority and ancient tradition. Whether Lycurgus was real or invented doesn't actually matter, because the system attributed to him was absolutely real, and it represented a fundamental insight that every dictator from Hitler to Mao would later rediscover. If you want total control over society, you must control reproduction itself. The Rhetra, Sparta's oral constitution, supposedly handed down by Lycurgus, didn't just establish laws about property or governance. It made every child born in Sparta the property of the state from the moment of conception, removing them entirely from parental authority and making their very existence contingent on state approval. Lycurgus allegedly banned gold and silver currency, replacing it with unwieldy iron bars to prevent wealth accumulation, redistributed all land equally among citizens so that economic class distinctions disappeared, and established mandatory communal dining halls where every citizen ate identical rations regardless of personal preference or family tradition. These reforms sound almost utopian until you realize their actual purpose, eliminating every possible competing loyalty that might interfere with state control over human breeding and child-rearing. The brilliance of the system was that it addressed the fundamental problem facing any society that wants to maintain a permanent warrior class. How do you keep soldiers training full-time when agriculture requires massive labor investment and economic production demands attention? Sparta's solution was elegantly simple and utterly monstrous. Conquer your neighbors, enslave them entirely, force them to produce all the food and perform all the labor, while your citizens do nothing but train for war from age 7 until death, and maintain this arrangement through systematic terrorism that makes rebellion suicide. Plutarch, writing 700 years after these reforms supposedly occurred, presents Lycurgus as a wise lawgiver who created stability through discipline and virtue. But what he's actually describing is the blueprint for totalitarian control over human reproduction that would be studied and imitated by every subsequent regime that believed human nature could be engineered through state power. If you're thinking this sounds uncomfortably familiar to certain 20th century experiments in creating the perfect society through selective breeding and state control of family life, stay with me because it gets so much worse. Imagine you're a Spartan father holding your 7-day-old son, and you know that in a few hours you'll carry him to the Lesje, the public building where the Gerousia, 28 men over 60 who form Sparta's ruling council, will inspect your child like livestock at auction. These elders will examine the naked infant according to criteria that Plutarch describes only as well-built and sturdy, checking for any visible weakness, deformity, or sign that this particular human being might not develop into an effective killing machine. If the child passes inspection, you receive permission to raise it, though raise is a generous term since the state will seize the boy at age 7 for 23 years of brutalization designed to eliminate every trace of individual personality. If the child fails inspection, you receive instructions to carry it to the Apothetai, a chasm or ravine on Mount Taygetus, where infants judged unworthy of life were left to die of exposure. And you will do this because refusal means losing your own citizenship and possibly your life. Now here's where it gets interesting from a historical verification standpoint. And if you're still watching, leave a comment telling me whether you think the ancient sources exaggerated this practice or if modern apologists are simply uncomfortable with the truth. Archaeological surveys of Mount Taygetus, conducted in the 1890s, and again extensively in the 1980s and 1990s, found adult skeletal remains, but no evidence of mass infant disposal, which has led some modern scholars to argue that the infanticide story was either propaganda by Sparta's enemies or a practice that occurred rarely rather than systematically. But here's the problem with that argument. Infant bones are incredibly fragile. They decompose rapidly in acidic mountain soils, and 2,000 years of erosion, animal activity, and natural processes would scatter and destroy most evidence, even if the practice occurred exactly as described. More importantly, multiple ancient sources, including Plutarch, who generally admired Sparta, describe the inspection and exposure process as routine, and there's no evidence of internal Spartan sources contradicting this account. What we can verify with certainty is that Sparta had a formal state mechanism for deciding which infants lived, that this decision was made by political authorities rather than families, and that the criteria involved physical assessment of newborns. Whether the rejected infants were thrown into a specific chasm, exposed on the mountainside more generally, or disposed of through other means that leave no archaeological trace is almost beside the point. The state claimed the authority to execute infants based on physical inspection, and they exercised that authority for centuries. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the infants who died. Every Spartan citizen who survived childhood knew they had passed an inspection that others failed, embedding in their identity from birth the understanding that their existence was contingent on state approval, and that some human lives were simply worth less than others. This wasn't just eugenics in the modern sense of trying to improve the species through selective breeding. It was a comprehensive system of psychological control that made every citizen complicit in state violence before they were old enough to form memories. While Athens and other Greek city-states kept women confined to domestic quarters where they learned weaving, household management, and how to be properly submissive to male authority, Sparta implemented something that looks superficially like ancient feminism, but was actually livestock management applied to human females. Spartan girls underwent athletic training that shocked foreign observers. They ran, wrestled, threw discus and javelin, and according to multiple ancient sources, including the playwright Euripides, they performed these exercises wearing short tunics or completely naked while men watched and evaluated their physical development. Before you think this represents some enlightened view of gender equality, understand that Plutarch explicitly states the purpose. Physical training was to ensure that the children conceived in strong bodies would grow strong themselves. The goal wasn't female empowerment or athletic achievement for its own sake. It was biological optimization to produce women with robust cardiovascular systems, wide pelvises for childbirth, and low body fat percentages that maximize fertility, while minimizing maternal mortality. The training regimen began around age 7. The same age boys entered the agoge, and continued until marriage in the late teens or early 20s, which was significantly later than other Greek cities, where girls typically married at 14 or 15. This delayed marriage served multiple state purposes. It ensured physical maturity before pregnancy, maximized the effectiveness of athletic conditioning, and gave authorities time to assess which women possessed superior genetics worth concentrating through selective breeding arrangements. Spartan women didn't just exercise, they competed publicly in races that awarded prizes for athletic excellence. They performed ritual dances that required significant physical exertion, and they sang choral songs that explicitly mocked cowardice and celebrated military valor. The entire female experience was structured around the message that their bodies were vehicles for producing warriors, and their worth would be measured entirely by the quality of offspring they generated. Ancient sources suggest that Spartan women owned property, managed estates while husbands lived in barracks, and spoke publicly with authority that would have been scandalous in Athens. And modern scholars sometimes present this as evidence that Sparta valued women more highly than other Greek states. But this interpretation gets causation backwards. Spartan women received property rights because men were constantly at war or living communally and someone needed to manage agricultural production. And they received social freedom because the state needed confident, assertive breeders who would produce psychologically strong children rather than the submissive, sheltered women other cities produced. Every apparent freedom served the reproductive control system, and the cost was a society where women's entire existence was reduced to breeding function, where physical weakness became grounds for social marginalization, and where motherhood itself became a form of compulsory military service to the state. If you're finding this disturbing, hit that like button and keep watching, because we're about to get into how Sparta structured marriage itself as a breeding program that makes modern dating apps look wholesome by comparison. Spartan marriage didn't begin with courtship, engagement, or ceremony. It began with staged kidnapping. The groom and his friends would abduct the bride from her family home in a ritual that everyone involved understood was coming, but which deliberately mimicked actual violent capture. Before the groom arrived, a matron prepared the bride by shaving her head completely, dressing her in male clothing and sandals, and leaving her alone in a dark room where the groom would visit briefly, have sex with her, and then return to his military barracks, where he would continue living for potentially years before the couple lived together openly. Plutarch claims this ritual served to maintain erotic desire through scarcity and transgression, and that the shaved head and male clothing eased young men accustomed to the company of other males into heterosexual relations. But what the ritual actually accomplished was far more calculated. The staged abduction severed the bride's psychological connection to her birth family by making her kidnapping the foundational memory of marriage. It established absolute male dominance as the basis of the relationship, and it delayed cohabitation until pregnancy was confirmed, ensuring the marriage served its reproductive purpose before resources were committed to household formation. But here's where Sparta's breeding program gets truly extraordinary. Sexual jealousy and exclusive pair bonding, which every other human society treats as fundamental to marriage, were engineered away as obstacles to optimal reproduction. Plutarch describes older men with young wives lending them to younger, more physically fit warriors for conception, brothers being encouraged to share a single wife to concentrate bloodlines and property, and men who saw women who appeared to be excellent physical specimens requesting permission from their husbands to impregnate them. Requests that husbands were socially expected to grant if the suitor was a distinguished warrior. These arrangements had no equivalent anywhere else in Greece, where adultery was a serious crime and cuckoldry was grounds for divorce and blood vengeance. Sparta systematically eliminated sexual possessiveness as a barrier to state-controlled breeding, treating marriage not as a personal relationship, but as a temporary breeding contract where genetic material was state property that could be redistributed according to strategic goals. The consequences rippled through the entire social structure in ways that ultimately contributed to Sparta's collapse. Children often didn't know their biological fathers. Half-siblings were raised together without knowledge of their genetic relationships, and the family bonds that formed the foundation of every other Greek society were deliberately fractured to prevent kinship loyalty from competing with state allegiance. Aristotle, observing this system from outside, noted with alarm that Spartan women had accumulated approximately 2/5 of all land ownership, which he blamed for Sparta's military decline. But he missed the deeper point. A system that treated women as breeding stock while granting them property, rights to manage estates, created structural contradictions that guaranteed collapse once the military success that justified the entire arrangement began to falter. At age 7, Spartan boys were ripped from their mother's arms and inducted into the Eugenics, the state training system that would control every aspect of their existence for the next 23 years. They were organized into age group herds called Ageli, assigned to barracks under supervision of a paedonomos, an adult male with authority to inflict any punishment he deemed necessary, and placed under the immediate control of an iron, a man in his late teens or early 20s who had survived the same system, and now held the right to beat younger boys for any perceived failing. The boys received 1 cloak per year regardless of weather, were forbidden to wear shoes even in winter, slept on reed mattresses, they had to gather themselves from riverbanks, using only their bare hands, and were given deliberately insufficient food rations with the explicit expectation that they would steal to supplement their diet. When caught stealing, they were beaten severely not for the theft itself, but for the incompetence of getting caught, teaching them that rules existed, but survival required breaking them skillfully while avoiding consequences. Physical punishment was constant, systematic, and escalating in severity throughout the training. Boys were whipped for speaking unnecessarily, for showing emotion, for failing to endure pain silently, for any behavior that suggested individual personality might be surviving the conditioning process. The most extreme version occurred during the annual Diamastagosis at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where boys competed to endure ritual whipping without crying out. And some ancient sources claim boys occasionally died during this ordeal, though later Roman-era accounts may have exaggerated the brutality for tourist entertainment value. The genius of the system's psychological architecture lay in how it made older boys responsible for brutalizing younger ones, creating a hierarchy where violence flowed downward while loyalty flowed upward, ensuring that victims eventually became perpetrators, and that everyone was complicit in maintaining the system. Academic education existed, but was minimal: basic literacy, some music and poetry with martial themes, and the famously terse Spartan speaking style that Plutarch presents as admirable, but which represented systematic educational deprivation designed to prevent philosophical questioning or rhetorical skill that might threaten state authority. At age 12, the training intensified in ways that modern sources often describe euphemistically, but ancient sources are quite explicit. Boys were expected to form sexual relationships with their Irines, the 20-year-old supervisors who held absolute authority over them. These relationships were presented as educational mentorship, but they occurred in isolated environments where adolescent boys had no power to refuse the sexual demands of adult men who could beat them with impunity. And the entire arrangement was normalized as necessary for producing the intense emotional bonds that would later translate into battlefield unit cohesion. If you're still watching this, drop a comment telling me if you think schools today should stop romanticizing Spartan education. And make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to get into the final stage of Eugenics training that explicitly involved practicing murder on the enslaved population. The final stage of the Eugenics was the Cryptia, which ancient sources describe with a mixture of horror and grudging admiration as a secret service operation where young men in their late teens or early 20s were sent into the countryside with minimal provisions and instructions to survive by hunting and killing helots. The enslaved agricultural population that outnumbered Spartan citizens by somewhere between 7 to 1 and 10 to 1. Plutarch, who generally presents Sparta sympathetically, calls the Cryptia altogether a wicked thing, but he also notes it continued for centuries as state-sanctioned practice. The young men operated at night, targeting helots who appeared strong, capable, or potentially rebellious, killing them and leaving their bodies as a message to the surviving population that resistance meant death, and that even the most capable among them could be eliminated at any moment. Modern apologists for Sparta sometimes claim the Cryptia was rare, reserved for elite families, or primarily intelligence gathering rather than systematic murder. But these arguments ignore both the explicit descriptions in ancient sources and the mathematical logic of the system. Sparta maintained roughly 8 to 10,000 full citizens, ruling over 70 to 90,000 enslaved helots, whose ancestors had been conquered militarily and who harbored generational hatred of their masters. This demographic imbalance meant that any significant helot uprising could destroy Sparta overnight, making constant terrorism not just policy preference, but existential necessity. The Cryptia served multiple purposes simultaneously. It kept the helot population traumatized and submissive through random violence. It eliminated potentially rebellious individuals before they could organize resistance. And it taught young Spartans to kill human beings without hesitation or moral qualms. The psychological transformation required to hunt and murder defenseless agricultural workers in the darkness was the final step in converting children into state instruments of violence, who had been systematically stripped of every moral framework that might interfere with following orders. But the Cryptia was just the visible manifestation of a larger legal structure that reveals how deeply the terrorism was embedded in Spartan governance. Every year when the Ephors, the 5 annually elected executives who held significant power, took office, one of their first official acts was to formally declare war on the helot population. This was a metaphorical or symbolic. It was a legal mechanism that made killing helots justifiable homicide rather than murder, allowing any Spartan who killed a helot to avoid religious pollution, legal consequences, or social stigma. The annual war declaration transformed population control from crime into patriotic duty, and when combined with the Cryptia practice, it represented systematic genocide in slow motion, identifying and eliminating the most capable members of the enslaved population, while keeping the submissive and broken alive to continue agricultural production. The Spartans had engineered a system where violence against the defenseless began in childhood and continued throughout life, where murder was normalized as civic duty, and where the demographic reality of 9 subjugated people for every free citizen made military supremacy not a cultural choice, but the only alternative to immediate retribution from the population they had spent centuries terrorizing. 371 BC. A battlefield at Leuctra in central Greece. The Theban general Epaminondas deploys an unprecedented deep column formation that concentrates overwhelming force on one wing of the Spartan phalanx, and when the dust settles, 400 Spartiate warriors, full citizens who had survived the inspection, endured the eugenics, and spent decades training for exactly this kind of battle, lie dead in a single afternoon. For any normal Greek city-state, losing 400 hoplites would be a serious defeat, but not a civilization-ending catastrophe. For Sparta, it was demographic apocalypse because those 400 dead warriors represented an irreplaceable chunk of a citizen population that had been declining for decades, and that lacked any mechanism to absorb significant casualties. The brutal math was this. Sparta in its height maintained approximately 8 to 10,000 full citizens, but by 480 BC, that number had declined to perhaps 8,000, by 418 BC around 5,000, and after Leuctra, perhaps only 1,000 remained. Within 70 years, the society that had terrorized Greece would field armies where the majority of soldiers weren't Spartan citizens at all, but rather mercenaries, freed helots, and members of lower status classes who had been granted quasi-citizen status because there simply weren't enough Spartiates left to form an army. By 244 BC, Plutarch records only 700 Spartiate families in existence, of which only 100 possessed significant land, and the society that had obsessively pursued military perfection through genetic selection had effectively bred itself into extinction. Multiple reinforcing mechanisms drove this collapse, starting with the obvious fact that constant warfare killed breeding-age males, whether Sparta won or lost. The 300 at Thermopylae became eternal legends, but they were also 300 men who would never produce offspring. And every battle victory or defeat represented genetic losses the system couldn't replace because the entire social structure, the late marriage age, the barracks living, the compressed window for reproduction, limited how many children each generation could produce. The eugenics that supposedly created superior warriors actually reduced reproductive fitness because men didn't establish households until age 30, meaning they had fewer reproductive years than Athenian men who married earlier and lived with their families. The equal land distribution designed to maintain citizen equality became a demographic trap because men who couldn't afford mandatory contributions to their syssitia the common mess, lost citizenship, and as warfare killed citizens and their widows inherited land, parcels consolidated until Sparta had abundant land but insufficient citizens to work it. Wealth concentration among women accelerated catastrophically because the wife-sharing system and male barracks living meant women managed estates, and when husbands died in battle, widows inherited everything. Aristotle observed this phenomenon with alarm, noting that women owned approximately 2/5 of Sparta's land. But the deeper problem was that the system had deliberately fractured normal family structure to optimize breeding, and the unintended consequence was creating economic incentives that worked against reproduction. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which historical empires collapse you want covered next, because we're about to get into how Sparta's influence survived its collapse and infected modern ideology in ways that led directly to the 20th century's worst atrocities. Sparta militarily collapsed in the 4th century BC and became politically irrelevant by the 2nd century BC. But its ideological influence metastasized across 2 millennia in ways that would have horrified even the most brutal Spartan warrior. The Spartans themselves left almost no written records, no philosophy, no drama, no historical texts, but other Greeks couldn't stop writing about them. And those texts became weapons that every subsequent authoritarian movement would use to justify their own brutality. Plato's Republic, written in Athens during Sparta's decline, proposes a state where philosopher kings rule. Children are raised communally away from parents, and family bonds are subordinated to state loyalty. It's basically Sparta, with better marketing and philosophical justification. Plutarch, writing under Roman rule in the 1st to 2nd century AD, presented Sparta as an exemplar of virtue, discipline, and civic devotion, filtering extreme brutality through philosophical abstraction and presenting systematic child abuse as admirable educational rigor. And his life of Lycurgus became the primary source that shaped how Western civilization understood Sparta for the next 2,000 years. The French Revolution embraced Sparta explicitly. Robespierre quoted Lycurgus to justify the terror. Revolutionary festivals mimicked Spartan religious ceremonies, and the Committee of Public Safety operated on pure Spartan logic that virtue required violence, that the Republic required blood sacrifice, and that individual rights were obstacles to collective perfection. When the revolution began executing its own children, it was following Sparta's blueprint to its inevitable conclusion. But the real explosion of Spartan influence came in the 19th century when scientific racism merged with Darwinian evolution to create the eugenics movement. And suddenly Sparta became Exhibit A for proving that racial perfection could be achieved through selective breeding. Arthur de Gobineau used Sparta to argue that racial mixing causes civilizational decline. Francis Galton cited Spartan practices when proposing systematic human breeding programs. And by the early 20th century, Sparta had become the historical justification for forced sterilization laws, marriage restrictions, and reproductive control policies implemented across the United States and Europe. Nazi Germany took this Spartanism to its logical conclusion in ways that historians still struggle to fully articulate. Adolf Hitler kept Plutarch's Lives on his bedside table and referenced it constantly. Heinrich Himmler explicitly designed SS training on Agog principles. Remove boys from families, subject them to brutal conditioning, normalize violence, create unit cohesion through shared suffering, make them instruments of state will. And the entire Nazi ideological framework was built on the premise that Sparta had proven that genetic perfection was achievable through state control of reproduction and systematic elimination of the weak. The Lebensborn program that bred racially pure children through selected partnerships was Spartan wife sharing with industrial efficiency. The Einsatzgruppen murdering civilians in occupied territories were practicing an updated version of the Krypteia, and the death camps themselves represented the final evolution of Sparta's logic that some human lives are worth less than others, and that perfection justifies any cost, including the systematic murder of millions. The connection wasn't hidden or metaphorical. Nazi policy documents, training manuals, and propaganda explicitly reference Sparta to provide historical legitimacy for programs that would otherwise seem unprecedented. If ancient Greeks who founded Western civilization practiced infanticide, eugenic breeding, and terrorism against subject populations. Then Nazi Germany was simply recovering lost wisdom that weak modern societies had abandoned. Every authoritarian ideology promises the same seductive bargain. Sacrifice freedom now, endure hardship now, accept control now, and we will achieve perfection. Sparta offers a 500-year case study in what that perfection actually costs, and why the pursuit of it always ends in catastrophic failure. The Spartan system was logically coherent if you accepted its premises. If military supremacy is the highest value, then society should be organized entirely around producing superior warriors. If superior warriors require genetic selection and total devotion to state, then infanticide and elimination of family bonds are justified. If maintaining the system requires enslaving neighbors and terrorizing them into permanent submission, that's simply the price of perfection. But every optimization produces fragility because complex systems, biological, social, economic, survive through diversity, redundancy, and adaptability. Sparta optimized entirely for heavy infantry combat in the phalanx formation, and when military technology evolved toward light infantry, cavalry, siege warfare, and naval power, the entire society lacked any mechanism to adapt because adaptation would have required questioning like Kyrgyz, which was ideologically impossible. The genetic selection program that supposedly produced superior warriors actually reduced population fitness through inbreeding depression, loss of genetic diversity, and accumulation of harmful recessive traits that inevitably occur in small breeding populations. The brutal training that created fearless warriors also produced psychological damage that reduced strategic thinking and made Spartans terrible at adapting to changing battlefield conditions. The helot system that freed citizens to train full-time required constant military force to maintain, creating a feedback loop where Sparta needed overwhelming military power to prevent rebellion, but needed helot agriculture to support the military training that maintained overwhelming power. The system was stable only as long as every variable remained constant, and the moment any single element failed, a major battlefield defeat, an earthquake that killed thousands of citizens, a helot rebellion that required external help to suppress, the entire structure began collapsing because optimization had eliminated every buffer and backup system that might have provided resilience. Modern societies face constant pressure to optimize everything. Optimize education for standardized test scores. Optimize hiring for measurable credentials. Optimize reproduction through genetic screening and embryo selection. Optimize military forces for specific threat scenarios. Each optimization promises efficiency and perfection, and each eliminates the diversity and redundancy that allows systems to survive unexpected challenges. We screen embryos for genetic defects and abort fetuses with Down syndrome at rates exceeding 90%. We design educational systems that sort children into tracks based on narrow assessment metrics. We implement policies that make childbearing contingent on economic productivity. And we do all of this while insisting we're nothing like the ancient Greeks, who threw infants off cliffs, because we're making informed choices rather than following state mandates. But Sparta's mistake wasn't having the wrong goals. Strength, courage, discipline, and excellence remain admirable virtues. Sparta's mistake was believing these virtues could be engineered through systematic elimination of human variability, through state control of reproduction, through subordinating every other value to a single definition of perfection. The question isn't whether we should pursue excellence. It's whether we're wise enough to recognize that human excellence emerges from diversity, develops through freedom, and flourishes in systems that tolerate imperfection rather than trying to engineer it away through control and elimination. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of person who wants truth backed by evidence rather than just compelling narratives. So before we wrap up, we need to address what archaeology actually reveals about Sparta versus what ancient texts claim. The challenge is that Sparta deliberately created almost no written records, left minimal material culture compared to other Greek cities. And by the time we have detailed written descriptions from authors like Plutarch, we're reading accounts written centuries after the classical period when Sparta had already collapsed. The Apothetei ravine on Mount Taygetus has been surveyed extensively, most recently in comprehensive archaeological surveys during the 1980s and 1990s, and researchers found adult skeletal remains, but no evidence of mass infant disposal. This has led modern scholars to argue that ancient sources exaggerated or invented the infanticide practice. But this interpretation requires ignoring both the basic facts of bone preservation and the multiple independent textual sources describing the practice. Infant bones are incredibly fragile, decompose rapidly in acidic mountain soils, and 2 millennia of erosion, animal scavenging, and natural processes would eliminate most traces even if the practice occurred exactly as described. The surveys covered limited areas of vast mountain territory, and exposure doesn't require a specific disposal site. Infants could have been abandoned across wide regions, leaving no concentrated remains. What archaeology does confirm definitively is the Syssitia communal dining system through excavated buildings that match ancient descriptions. The sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, where thousands of lead warrior figurines were deposited as offerings, and where a Roman-era theater was built for tourists to watch whipping ceremonies. And burial evidence showing increasing wealth inequality over time despite ideological claims of egalitarian citizenship. Isotope analysis of classical period skeletal remains shows Spartan citizens had moderate nutrition consistent with simple rations, while Messenian remains show significantly worse nutrition, confirming systematic resource extraction from the Helot population. Survey archaeology in Messenia reveals settlement patterns consistent with an enslaved agricultural workforce living in small farmsteads, lacking the public buildings and sanctuaries characteristic of free communities. Perhaps most revealing is what archaeology doesn't find: evidence of the cultural production that characterized other Greek cities. Sparta has yielded minimal pottery of artistic merit, very little sculpture compared to Athens or Corinth, no philosophical texts, no mathematical treatises, no astronomical observations, and no medical writings. The archaeological record confirms that Sparta's single-minded military focus came at the cost of virtually every other form of human achievement. The material evidence also shows how quickly Sparta collapsed once military superiority faded. Luxury goods appear in tombs from the 4th century BC onward, indicating the egalitarian system broke down rapidly after Leuctra. And by the Roman period, archaeological remains show Sparta had become a typical Greek city with wealthy families, many poor ones, and none of the systematic infrastructure that characterized the classical system. The final archaeological irony is the Roman period renovation of the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia that included building a theater for spectators to watch reenactments of a Gauge training. Sparta's brutal child-rearing system that once produced history's most feared warriors had become tourist entertainment, a living museum where wealthy Romans paid to watch performances of the brutality that had terrified their ancestors. Sparta asked a question that every society eventually faces: what would you sacrifice for perfection? They sacrificed their children through infanticide and brutal conditioning, their freedom through totalitarian state control, their culture through single-minded military focus, their humanity through systematic terrorism against an enslaved population, and ultimately their survival through demographic collapse that resulted directly from the breeding program designed to create superior humans. The answer to what perfection cost turned out to be everything, and the perfect warriors they created through 5 centuries of optimization lasted exactly as long as battlefield conditions favored their specific training before the entire system collapsed, so completely that within 2 centuries Sparta became a tourist attraction, performing their own history as entertainment. The 300 at Thermopylae made their final stand because they had spent their entire lives being conditioned to value nothing else. And we celebrate their sacrifice while carefully ignoring that they were manufactured through systematic child abuse, eugenic breeding programs, and a social system maintained through the terrorism of 9 enslaved people for every free citizen. If this documentary made you rethink everything you thought you knew about ancient history's most celebrated warriors, smash that subscribe button. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive into the dark truths behind historical legends. And drop a comment telling me which empire's brutal secrets you want exposed next. Because there's no shortage of societies that pursued perfection through monstrous means, and history is absolutely filled with warnings we keep ignoring. The pit on Mount Taygetus is still there, tourists still visit it. And we still tell ourselves we're too enlightened to make Sparta's mistakes while implementing genetic screening programs, optimizing education systems for narrow metrics, and treating human reproduction as a problem requiring systematic control and improvement. The Spartans at least had the excuse that they didn't know their system would fail. We have 500 years of evidence showing exactly where this logic leads, and we're following the same path anyway.